Okay. Okay, we're all yours.
You're okay. Well, let me get my screen going. There we go. And we will start the slideshow. And so it is up. So how you doing, Sally? Oh, can she hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you more or less. My hearing is lousy, so
Can you turn the volume up on your computer?
it's up.
Okay.
It's up. Well, let's try this then. Linda, do you have the option for closed captions?
I might.
Does it work when you're just talking?
It does. It's not perfect.
Well, hang on. Let me. I have the.
I see a CC.
Okay, so do you see where it says Ryan requests live transcript enabling?
So I requested. I think you need to approve it somewhere.
Okay.
There we go.
It's been enabled.
So hopefully you can see on the bottom.
Yes, I can see it.
I don't know how great it is. I think it does a pretty good job.
It's
It
doing
does.
well.
Yeah,
right now.
I think it does better than the closed captions on television, which is a low bar, I know.
So hopefully that helps you, Sally.
Yes, it will be very good.
Yeah, okay, let me go back to my screen share now. And I always kind of cringe at closed captions because it captures everything I say. So when I misspeak or something, it always shows up. So it puts more pressure on me to be careful with my words.
Well, pretend it's not there.
No, I will. I'll be good.
Okay.
Yeah, you know who I am. We are on inequality today. You will wrap up next week with Alan on trade. It looks like Alan's already talked about trade and globalization, which will come in here a little bit as we talk about inequality too. So I'm glad that's been discussed. Since it is a small group, you know this, Sally, if you have any questions, just fire away and I will happily take a minute and pause and we can go through your questions. So one of my passions, and I don't know if this is the right word, passion, but over the last 5 or 6 years, I've done a lot of development of coursework to help students understand economic inequality. For me, I see inequality as one of the biggest challenges that we face going forward, more than anything else, because it is driving the divide in this country. I also believe climate change is a challenge, but I can't imagine being able to address climate change in a world in which inequality is continually worsening. People are frustrated, they're being left behind, and it's creating this pretty sort of deep divide in this country, right? So when we look at inequality, there's a few lenses in which we'll look through. There is income inequality, which is obviously getting a lot of attention. There is wealth inequality, which is far greater than income inequality. And these are the stories behind Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax and things like that. And then there's consumption inequality, which are all three different ways of measuring inequality. Most of our attention will be on income and wealth inequality. I mean, we know what income is, we know what wealth is, so I can skip over that. Now, one of the things that is interesting when we start looking at inequality, we'll look at this over time quite a bit. Within the US, income and wealth inequality has worsened significantly. So we can look at it how it's divided across the population, but then we also can look at it across different groups of people. Is there inequality between race? Is there inequality between genders and things like that? So there's different dimensions in which we can look at inequality when we start discussing these metrics. We'll look at a few of them, but the primary way we typically start looking at inequality is more at this aggregate level, just a simple question over how has the income distribution in a country changed. So we can look at that. This graph, Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez are at UC Berkeley, and they've done a lot of research on capturing inequality in the United States over the last 100 years. This is the bulk of where their research has been. They get this data through tax returns. So this is about the best data we can get on measuring inequality. And what this graph really points to is the share of income going to the top 10% of income earners. And you can see it's steadily been increasing since the 1980s. Go for it, Sally.
My comment is just that notice that the scale starts with 30 instead of 0.
Yes. I didn't make this graph, but yes, a lot of times we do challenge, with spacing, it gets a little bit difficult to cram it in. So it does, if you walk through it, start at about 40%. It does rise to its peak right before the Great Depression, close to 50%, and then it falls after World War II and stabilizes throughout the 60s and 70s. And then from the 1980s onward, it steadily increases to where it is today at about 51%. So yes.
So what changed in 1980?
We'll talk about this. There's been a lot of changes over the last 30 to 40 years that have contributed to this divide. So first is the tax system, right? Starting in 1980, the tax system became much less progressive. And so that was with a lot of the Reagan tax cuts. In the mid 1990s, trade, globalization increased significantly. Both of those periods brought largely a decline in unionization rates in the US. The middle basically vanished. And so those are largely the bigger drivers, and perhaps the biggest is still technology. Gains to technology have gone a long way. And another thing that's driving inequality that doesn't get as much attention is the household dynamic. Household demographics have changed significantly. In the 1940s and 50s, when marriages happened, you kind of had the traditional house rule, right? The husband would work and the wife would stay at home and take care of the family, take care of the households. And so the story as we tell it typically is husbands were looking for a good wife to stay at home and raise children and raise the family and support the family needs. But then what started happening in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, as women entered the labor force, now you see more matching off of talent. And so you see doctors and doctors getting married, you see lawyers and lawyers getting married, you see two professionals getting married. So that's greatly changed the household dynamic. And so now instead of having a household income of $250,000 with a doctor and a stay-at-home wife, you now have two doctors making $500,000 in the same household.
Yeah.
So household dynamics have also shifted significantly, which play a role in this as well. The other story is, as these incomes have increased, you've also seen now these doctors and the lawyers, the high income households, also shift to being the capital owners. They now hold the majority of stock, right? Which is exacerbating wealth inequality as well. So you're seeing a concentration of income to professional households, but then you're seeing a concentration of assets also to those households. So it's an interesting dynamic. We'll talk more about it. So stock market crash, World War I, dot-com bubble, those are your big events. You can see they obviously have an effect on inequality, but not massive. Over the long term, they're just blips. And then the housing bubble. So kind of what I just said, 1970s, towards the end of the 1970s is when the income gap started to get skewed even more. What we've seen now over the last 20 to 30 years is the median income in the US has been relatively stagnant, whereas the income of the top earners has continually increased. And so I have that slide here to highlight that point. So again, this is how much income relative to 1973. So the median household has seen their income go up, but just by a small amount. It really has not gone up much at all.
That's since the 80s.
Since the 80s, there was lots of, but this is consistent, lots of growth in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But then inequality worsened, as we saw in that previous graph, pretty noticeably in the 1980s. So high income earners are doing much better today than the median income earners in the bottom 20th percentile. Now, one comment that I will get from those that are skeptical of inequality increasing is they'll say, well, this just takes the median household, and it doesn't account for the fact that people generally move up the income ladder as they gain more experience. So someone in 1980 that was in the 20th percentile might have been a household that was 20, 25 years old, just starting their career. And so by 2000, we wouldn't expect that to be that household. So now they're 40, 45, making more money. So they should move up the percentiles, is one of the arguments we get. Except we don't see that mobility very much. That's the other piece of this puzzle that has changed, that I will mention, and that I'll show a figure on later on. The moving up, what we call economic mobility, someone born in a lower income situation, and the likelihood of them moving up the income ladder into being higher income is getting harder and harder to do. So it's more likely, if you were born in a low income household and you start as a low income household in 1980, you are likely going to remain in that situation for the majority of your life. There was a paper out called the fading of the fading of the American dream. And what it showed back in the 1950s was 9 out of 10 children born in the 1950s and 60s would have a higher income than their parents. And the idea of the American dream is the land of opportunity. You have a great school system and you're able to create a better life for yourself than your parents did for them. And today that is less than half. So half of the children born in the millennial generation, which I will say is me. I do admit I'm a millennial. I'm on the very cusp of Generation X and millennials, but those that are a millennial, it's now less than 50% chance of having an outcome better than your parents. Now, part of that is because our parents are doing fairly well, but the other part of that is the loss of mobility, right? It's getting harder and harder to find the jobs of the 50s, 60s, and 70s that really sustained economic growth in the US. So this is just the Gini coefficient, because one of the things I do like to just point out is this is how we measure inequality, because you'll see this a lot. And the idea is really simple. It ranges from 0 to 1. 0, and I'll show you how we calculate this, is if everyone has the same income. So the bottom 20% of the income distribution takes home 20% of the income. The next 20% takes home the next 20% of the income. So it would be a perfectly equal distribution. If it equals 1, then it's perfect inequality. One person has all of the income. So for reference, we typically look at these thresholds. 0.5 to 0.7 is highly unequal, and 0.2 to 0.35 is relatively equal. So what that looks like, right, this is kind of more what I teach my students, is the population is down here on the x-axis and the percent of income is on the y-axis. So if 20% of the income of the population had 20% of the income, it would lie on this 45-degree line. And so that's the line of equality. The actual point here, this Lorenz curve, is what we actually observe. And so a country that has a relatively equal distribution will have a Lorenz curve that lies really close to the line of equality. A country where, you know, and take this case, right, where about 50% of the population has maybe 10% of the income. So that's going to be a very unequal distribution. The Gini coefficient is this area in here. So if it's 0, there is no area. If it's 1, it's a very big area. So that's where the Gini coefficient comes from. So you'll see that a lot in our data, because you'll see the Gini coefficient mentioned. And when you read inequality, even articles in the Wall Street Journal or New York Times, they reference the Gini coefficient. So just recognize where that measure comes from, right? So here you can see in the US, perfect equality would be that lowest income quintile, the bottom 20% of our income distribution would have 20% of our population would have 20% of the income. They have 3.1%. The next 20% has 8.2%. The next 20% has 14.3%. So another way of thinking about that is 60% of our population has about 25% of the income, right? So that's fairly skewed, right? And so that's where the Gini coefficient comes from. It's not until you get into the 4th and 5th quintiles where you start seeing most of the income be had. So that's just how we measure inequality. So again, same breakdown. You can see how inequality has changed. Now this says nothing about income growth, but what it does show us is that from 1970 through today, the share of the pie. So I always like thinking about a pie. I like pie. The pie has gotten much bigger, right? From 1970 to 2020. We have a lot more income today than we did 50 years ago. So even that first quintile, they're getting a smaller slice, a smaller share of the pie, but they're still getting a little bit more pie. It's just now that upper quintile, that top 20% of income earners, they're getting a much larger share of the pie. They're now getting more than half of it. And not only are they getting more than half of it, they're getting more than half of a bigger pie. So they are getting a pretty good slice out of this. And so you can see where these people are in terms of income. So these are the cutoffs. So where you would need to be, right? In the 25th percentile, it's $15,000. In the 36th percentile, or the median is 36,000. The 75th is 65. The 90th is 112. The 95th is 164,000. The 99th is 491,000. And the top 1%, it's the mean income of the top 1% of earners is $1.1 million. So that's fairly high when you compare that to 1975. And so this is in today's dollars, right? So you can see what I was saying in that for the bottom group, their income has gone up. It's just, it hasn't gone up as much as the rich. And if we had no increase in inequality, those would be your cutoffs. So what's happened obviously becomes very clear. Incomes are growing for everyone. They're just growing very, very slowly for the bottom, and they're growing much faster for the top, especially your top 1% of income earners. And so this is that Gini coefficient, right? When we look at inequality from 1960 onward, you see a steady increase in inequality of income, and then you see a massive increase in wealth inequality. And the wealth inequality is going to be tied to a few things. You can see it rising here in the dot-com boom. You can see it rising here again in the housing boom. And so in other words, those that have been in position with high incomes to take advantage of these really good times, they've been able to capitalize and see their wealth increase significantly. So wealth inequality has certainly been part of the story.
What is that decrease at the end in wealth inequality?
So 2015, so this is through 2019. And so if we obviously, I can tell you what it would look like if we had data in the last few years. We know it uptakes significantly, right? With the pandemic, wealth inequality worsened quite a bit. That downward tick is probably more just the stagnant market. The stock market was pretty flat in 2014, 15, and 16. So there wasn't big gains in wealth inequality in that period, would be my suspicion. And again, this was a story that was out today. I don't have the exact data, but there was a report published today that showed I'm going to find it really quick. I should have been more timely with this. Because it's a group that's advocating for the wealth tax, the Elizabeth Warren wealth tax. Oh, it was finding that if you had a wealth tax on households worth over $30 million, and it was only 0.1%, just something really tiny, it would have raised $400 billion this year in revenue.
Oh my.
So the wealth tax is going to generate a lot more I think a lot more motivation in the next few years. So 60s and 70s and 80s was probably when income and wealth were relatively the most equal, and then it's been eroding ever since. And this is the same thing we've looked at, right? If you look at the wealth distribution in the United States, you can see that it's gone up quite a bit. The wealth has largely now being concentrated in the hands of the top 20% of income earners, which is this group right here. Right, the average wealth for your 99th percentile is 7 times greater than what it was in 1963, and it's over $10 million. So therein lies the degree of the problem, right? Almost no difference at the bottom, so the wealth isn't increasing at the lower ends of the spectrum, right? And you can see this distribution of wealth is far worse than income inequality. And that's also partly because most high earners are, I mentioned the households are increasingly becoming the capital owners. They're the ones that high income households are the ones that own stock. They're the ones that own the corporations now more and more. And so they're getting a much bigger slice of the wealth distribution. So income distribution is bad. Wealth distribution is much worse, right? Whereas literally the top 1% of the wealthy have almost double the wealth of the bottom 90%. Go ahead, Sally.
Is there any kind of overvaluation of assets that could be contributing to this?
And I think that's actually a great question, because that's one of the challenges you have with the wealth tax is the valuation of assets, right? And so I think they do a pretty good job of getting real estate holdings and stock holdings to evaluate, but obviously with private companies and all the places where, and I would actually argue it might be under, because the one thing we do know with the wealthy is they're very good about hiding their wealth.
Oh, what I was curious about was, you have bubbles in the stock market and you have bubbles in the housing market. So there can be valuations that fluctuate a lot.
Yep. And you see that a little bit in the data, like here it went up significantly and it comes down. So you do see that a little bit in some of the trends. Here's the dot-com boom, and then it flattens out a little bit, right? So you do see some of the market effects have an impact on wealth. So no, you are right. You will see some of that for sure. So this is from the Council Congressional Budget Office, where they look at before taxes, the income share. Again, it's the same story. So I'll go through these fairly quickly. This is the projection for 2021 there in the bar. Before taxes, the growth of the top 1%, they've seen their income grow almost 300% from 1979, whereas for most of the bottom, modest growth, right? 33% from 1979. So that goes into that story I was saying is, for most households, if we tracked households over time, which we have some studies that do that, you don't see a lot of mobility of people moving up. So when you're in the lowest quintile in the 1980s, you're probably still in the lowest quintile in the 1990s and the 2000s. So there is certainly some of that going on. After taxes, gets a little bit better, right? You see the bottom does do better, right? Pretty, not hugely, but certainly going from 90, 42, and 41 to 98, 54, and 57. So there is some redistribution that does help the bottom of the income groups. So this was income growth in the 1980s, and this is pretty consistent with what I've been saying. Income growth is typically was highest for the lowest earners, and then relatively slower for the highest earners. Today, it's completely flip-flopped. Income growth is lowest for the lowest earners, but highest for the highest earners. So again, the story of being able to move up the income ladder, moving, into more opportunity is getting harder and harder for people if they are in the bottom of the income brackets. So that one we've already looked at. So the bigger question, right, is where does inequality come from? Inevitably, part of our inequality in the US is a artifact of the economic system we've designed, right? We reward different skills. We value things differently. And so that is certainly going to be where some of this inequality comes from, right? But there are also some built-in drivers that make inequality worse. Now, some of it, so as I go through these, I'll just start with demographics. If you have a population where you have a relatively large number of people that are in their 40s and 50s, and a relatively large number of people that are young or retired, you're going to see a natural increase in inequality because you'll end up with a large number, two sides, people working a bunch, earning their highest income they've ever earned, and then you have a large fraction of people not earning income at all. So part of it is the age distribution of our economy, right? Over the 90s and 2000s was when the baby boomer generation was in their prime adult working life. And so you had their incomes the highest, and when you had a large number of people in that area, it's going to just naturally make inequality worse, right? The other stuff are things that are more, we have it labeled personal choices, but I would also say societal choices is as a part of this. Mm-hmm. Educational attainment, we know, is one of the biggest drivers. The challenge is, and this is my biggest frustration with the Great Recession, the housing boom of 2007, 8, 9. We know the number one thing that enables people to move up the income ladder is education and having access to high quality public K through 12 educational systems. And in the 2000s, early 2000s, there, with the housing bubble booming, there was a rush for low income people to take opportunities and move into the higher income, better school district neighborhoods. Unfortunately, the housing boom crashed, and these same very households were the ones that ended up defaulting on their mortgages and losing their homes. In Seattle, so Raj Chetty is I don't know if you've seen his work. I'm actually going to pull it up really quick and share it because I think he does a great job of visualizing this. He is at Harvard right now. He was at Stanford, but he runs this website called Economic Opportunity. And if you want to just explore some of the stuff he does a lot of really fun stuff where you can look at neighborhoods, and I'll show you where I'm at here, begin exploring the data, where it's this sort of color grid of opportunity. And so areas in blue and green show a relatively high mobility. So in other words, if you click on, let's just say, I'll do San Francisco, Santa Rosa, you can see down here, right, the probability of them moving up the income ladder. So you can play around with this data. It's kind of fun to explore parent income. If you were born low income, right, it'll show you average income, household income at age 35. It'll show you all these outcomes, the most, where your likely outcome would be. And this is from tracking data, right? If you go to these red areas, this is where economic mobility is the lowest, right? This is household income, real household income at age 35 for a child that was born in a low income parent group. So they stay low income, right? So this is one of the big challenges. You can break it down by race. If you want to look at someone that was Black in a low income neighborhood, where their likely outcomes are best, and you can see largely you get similar distortions. We can look at Hispanic, we can look at Asian, we can look at American Indian, and just see where their opportunity is the greatest.
Wow.
And so it's kind of a fun website to navigate. And he's one of the few economists, he will in his time win the Nobel Prize for economics for being able to sort of visualize and show these effects. Seattle, Washington is using some of the stuff he's doing, and because one of the challenges people have is if you are low income and you are living in a low income area, it's hard to move out of that area, right? You tend to stay put where friends and family are, or you just can't afford to move elsewhere. Seattle started a program when they sent out the Title IX housing vouchers for households for their housing subsidies, of also sending out a pamphlet. And in that pamphlet, it says to these households, if you live here, this is the high school graduation rate that your kids will most likely experience. But if you move 3 miles away, this is where their more likely outcome for them. And so it was educating parents on where to live to give their kids the best opportunities to move ahead. And then they were providing some additional funds for them to actually afford housing in these better areas. So lots of cool programs are going on to help educate families on where is the best places to live. And you can go in here, there's a big article on this about how, and obviously the Seattle story is close to me because I'm near Seattle, but the idea is to take people up here into these neighborhoods. So if you followed Capitol Hill, where there was the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone and things like that in the news, I'm not sure, during the George Floyd riots, that's this area in red. So they're trying to educate the parents in this area, like, well, maybe you want to move over here, right, into these areas in green, and we're going to provide you with some housing subsidies to do that. And it'll walk you through some of the cool stuff. And so trying to get people to move into these better areas turns out does a lot to get people into better opportunities for their children. Because I think at the heart of it, I think everyone wants the best for their kids. They just can't afford anywhere else, so they don't move. They stay put. So lots of good stuff is coming out of this work that Raj is doing. So I would say educational attainment isn't a personal choice, but we can do a much better job at ensuring people have the information and the resources to make it a personal choice, to give us opportunity. Effort, I hate the effort one. This is a theory. You just gotta put on the boots, lace them up, and get to work and work hard, and everything will work in your favor, right? Unless you're, minority, female, like it doesn't always work that way. And if you don't have role models in these communities, especially the more diverse communities with a large number of minorities where there's not a large number of strong male role models for young boys, effort's going to be irrelevant in those situations. And so I just don't like effort. I don't like priorities because, again, at the end of the day, I think everyone, if we're talking about a family with children, it wants the best for their children, right? And then household composition, I talked about how we've shifted a little bit about who gets married, right, is a big part of it. You also throw in the fact that typically professional families, working professionals, have kids later in life when they can afford it. So they've been able to work most of their adult life and now have kids when they're 35, 40 years old. Whereas in a lot of instances in lower income communities, it sort of the problems get perpetuated because they have children when they're 18, 19 years old. And so they're not able to build a career and work and establish income because they've already been given this burden at a very young age. So those are some of those challenges there for sure. Immigration, also a big part of it. There's obviously a lot of challenges around immigration. David Card, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics this past year for a lot of his work on immigration, has looked at this in a lot of detail and does not find immigration on the low skilled end really, it doesn't have a massive effect on the wages for other low wage industries. If anything, it might make inequality worse because of the income differentials between the high wage immigrants coming in. If you're in Silicon Valley, all of your tech immigrants that come into those sectors versus all of the migrants coming up from Mexico doing field work, farm work. So it might actually worsen inequality based off of how immigration is in the US. Market forces, technology, I mentioned. Technology has made jobs obsolete. And so that has been a big part of inequality. Changing demand patterns, we buy different things. Competition for labor has played a role. If you are going to structure a service center, you can now go out to India or another country and use that labor as a substitute for US labor. So the competition for labor combined with the globalization has certainly contributed to inequality. Government policy, without a doubt, has created inequality, whether it's through, something like Citizens United that has enabled a lot more lobbying for higher income households, government subsidies to favored industries and things like that can certainly be a role for inequality. And we know with the changes to the tax system, it's changed the redistribution of income, right? With lower tax brackets for the highest income earners, that's going to directly make inequality worse. So what can the government do? And there's a few things, like there's when we talk about pre-distribution and redistribution. So the pre-distribution are things that they can do to help inequality, I would say, in the future, right? And I've already mentioned some of this stuff. Access to education is a big one, right? Getting kids into schools. I am a huge proponent of pre-K education for everyone. The cost of childcare is absurd these days. We need to make it affordable to have children, and we need to make it possible for people to have children and send them into good schools. So access to education is a big piece. This is a big story that's coming out right now. There is a lot of attention being paid to market consolidation and how that is affecting wages. And if there is an effect on consolidation and average earnings in these industries. So as firms get bigger and bigger and bigger, they essentially almost act like a monopoly in the market for labor. And so if they're the only buyer of someone's labor, they're going to be able to keep wages suppressed. Two examples that we use to kind of highlight the historical impact of this is nurses and teachers. And there's a gender component to this, obviously. If I'm a doctor, I'm historically perceived as the largest bread earner in that family, and I'm going to move to whatever city is going to pay me the most likely. Nurses historically have been the secondary income in a household. So they were rarely the primary income earners. And in a lot of cities, I'll use Spokane as an example, we have 2 hospital systems that are going to hire 95% of the nurses. And if the nurse is the secondary income earner in that household, they're not moving for that job. And so the hospital systems have been able to sort of exploit that by keeping nurses' pay lower than they otherwise would have had to have paid, because that nurse is never moving. And it's the same thing with teachers. In Spokane, where I live, District 81, Spokane School District, hires 90% of the teachers in Spokane. So, most teachers are, in a lot of instances, a secondary income in a household, and it's most likely the female income. You don't need to worry about paying them a competitive wage because they're not going anywhere. So when you get monopolies in these industries, they're able to essentially determine what wages are, as opposed to a competitive market that wages are determined by both the buyers of labor and the supplier of labor. And then regulations, minimum wage, overtime, health insurance, those are other things you can use to address inequality. I'm not a big minimum wage person. I would rather not see a minimum wage imposed on firms, but see something like a universal basic income posed after the fact. Is my take. Just because, I mean, I grew up in a family of small business owners, so that's sort of my effect there. But I also believe a UBI would be more sustainable, and it's a more stable source of income for low income households. We wouldn't have to worry about unemployment insurance and things like that, because there seems to be also a lot of turnover in those jobs. Tax rates are the main way, post income redistribution, income support programs, direct aid, food stamps, all that fun stuff. And these do matter. So redistribution does help. This is after tax income. And you can see the lowest quintiles, they do bump up a little bit. Not as much as we would like, but there is some gains there through those programs. tax rates. I had mentioned this before. The average income of the highest tax earners has increased significantly, but their average tax rate has also declined, right? And those that make a lot of money can also afford the best accountants in the world. And so that's one of the challenges, right? So if you look at changes in the tax code, and this has gotten worse with the Tax Cut and Jobs Act by President Trump, the average tax rates of the bottom earners have gone up, whereas the average tax rates of the top earners have gone down. Now, yes, the top earners are still paying more on average, but right, the tax system has gotten much, much less progressive over the last 50 to 60 years. So that was one of the things I mentioned about, well, what has made inequality worse, right? Certainly the tax system is part of it. I am going to point out, because a lot of people are quick to say, but I just saw in the recent article that 50% of our country doesn't pay federal income taxes. And they don't pay federal income taxes, but they are still paying Social Security and Medicare taxes. They're paying labor taxes, and they still pay state and local taxes. So I think it's important that when we talk about taxes, we're talking about all taxes. In Washington State, we might have the most regressive tax system in the country. We have no income tax, we have a sales tax, and that's about it. And we have a cigarette and alcohol taxes and stuff like that, which are inherently borne by lower income households. So we collectively have one of the more regressive tax systems. Lower income households pay a much higher percent of their income in taxes than I pay in mine. So I've talked about these, right? Technology, globalization, industry competition have driven some of the market inequality tied to the market. And the reality is technology is not going away. We know technology is going to continue to advance. We know it's going to be a disruptor of labor markets already. I mean, it is. So given we have these challenges, right, we have to overcome that through other creative and good policies. Globalization, yes, COVID is creating this onshoring of jobs, but globalization is going to continue, right? We're going to see new technologies. I mean, take autonomous vehicles. As soon as semi-trucks are self-driven, what's going to happen to all the truck drivers in this country, right? And economically, that's a huge economic gain for us, because you don't have to worry about trucks resting. They can drive all hours of the night. But that's going to be a huge disruption, right? With globalization, the economics profession was really pretty poor at recognizing this, because we used to tell this story of globalization that will create winners, right? In the US, the winners will be those in the industries that we export goods and services in. So it's going to be in technology, it's going to be in education. Those are going to be the winners. The people that lose from globalization are going to be those in the industries that we are going to be importing stuff, clothes, car parts, electronics, right? All those sorts of things. But it's okay, because collectively, we're all going to be better off, because our incomes are going to be much higher than they otherwise would have been. And I agree with that. Collectively, we are better off because of globalization, except we did a really poor job of recognizing those that were hurt. and had their jobs lost, and not realizing that the concentration of these job losses were going to be in largely in the same communities, right? They were in the Midwest. So all throughout the Midwest, they got hammered when NAFTA was signed and all of the car part manufacturing went to Mexico. So all of a sudden, Michigan, Ohio, Western Pennsylvania saw unemployment skyrocket. So we need to do a better job with this technological revolution of recognizing that technology is going to happen and that's fine and let's embrace it, but let's not forget that it's going to also be a disruption and the market's not going to instantly remedy that disruption, right? It needs policy efforts to ensure those that are hurt by technology are given opportunities elsewhere, right? You're not going to overnight be able to take truck drivers and move them into the medical field where the jobs are going to be, right? Labor market
could be nurses and stuff.
but that was what we said. Oh, there'll be jobs. People will just have to get retrained. And the reality is, if you're in the Midwest, and I don't know, Sally, where you grew up, are you a West Coast woman?
No, East Coast.
East
originally.
Coast. So like my whole family was from Wisconsin and South Dakota. So the kind of blue collar union worker was sort of what my family was. And I can tell you that they very much aren't the type where, hey, you just lost your job. Okay, that's okay. Why don't you just go move to California and get a job in healthcare? They don't want to, right? They don't want to leave their hometowns. They want to stay where they are. That's where family was. That's where they went to high school. And so we're going to have to work on making sure these people that are impacted by the continued technological revolution have support. Unionization, market concentration, all that fun stuff. Are things we'll look at. Labor characteristics. Again, education is the biggest driving force there. Market forces, how does the market value labor, and then government policies, right? Those are the big things. So a couple things have happened over time that get attention that I want to talk about. And again, you'll notice this break always seems to be right around the early 80s, late 70s. The blue line is worker productivity. So workers today have been as productive as they've ever been in history. And we used to talk about, in a competitive labor market, a worker should command their wage and it should be directly linked to productivity. And so as worker productivity goes up, it should increase their wage. And that's what happened in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Because in a competitive labor market, if I know I'm adding value to a company, I should be able to command that value, or else I'll just switch jobs and go to someone that will pay me that value, right? Was the story. But you can see now, right, the growth in wages and compensation has changed significantly. It's flat, it's much flatter. It's not growing at the same rate of productivity. So workers have become more and more and more productive, but they're not able to bargain that productivity into higher wages. And the other thing I'll point out here is we're looking at total compensation. And I don't think I have the data in this slide, but total compensation includes all forms of benefits. This includes retirement and healthcare. What's also changed is actual take-home pay. More and more of income for many workers is in the form of healthcare. So even though this is going up, if we were to strip out what you're actually taking home, it's much lower because a bigger chunk of this is going to pay for healthcare.
Mhm.
So workers are ultimately paying the price through lower take-home pay. So great, you get to keep healthcare, but you don't get paid. Your pay suffers. So unionization, I think this is a very telling graph. The blue line is the share of income going to the top 1%, and the red line is unionization memberships. And it's pretty clear, right? When unionization was the highest in the 60s and 70s, they were able to bargain for that productivity gain, right? Hey, we'll keep working hard, but you have to pay us our productivity. And going back to this figure, you see that, right? The union was the great bargainer for workers. So when productivity went up, they were able to go to the company and say, hey, look, this is our share, give us our share. Whereas now, as unionizations declined pretty significantly, that bargaining piece has gone away. And so now individually workers aren't able to sort of negotiate their productivity gains, right? And they're staying with the firm. So that's going to stay with the firm. It's going to go to the profitability of the company. It's going to go to the shareholders, right? So unionization, and I struggle with unionization. I'm not a huge fan of public sector unions. Private sector, I think they serve a much more valuable role. I like seeing Amazon being forced to have to deal with a union and their working conditions and the working quality. Back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, those working environments were really tough for a lot of people. So I don't mind seeing unionization in the private sector. Go ahead, Sally.
Yeah, you were talking about the teachers in Spokane who had
Yep.
one employer. They would benefit from a union.
So there you caught my one caveat. You're on this. I agree with you right there. That is where if you are sort of handicapped in an area where you have no other opportunity, right? So unions are the solution to monopolization, right? The monopoly is negotiating your wage down. The only way to counter that is with the union, right? One monopoly against another monopoly. And teachers have gotten pretty good at recognizing when it is the most valuable time to strike, right before the start of the school year. And good for them, right? As a parent, when September hits, I want my kids going back to school. So the teachers certainly have my sympathy at that point. So you're right, Sally. That is the one area at the kind of public side where you can equalize some of that inequality. This is that competition story. So return on capital of US publicly traded firms. So the richest firms have significantly improved and their income have gained quite a bit over this time period. So the return on capital has been, again, pretty exorbitant. And this is right when the Bush tax cuts went into effect, right in that 2001, 2002 period. So obviously some benefit there. And then this is the bigger one, the concentration by industries. So we talk about an industry being, we use what's called the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. And the way of thinking about it is really the higher the number, the more concentrated that industry is becoming. And so so what's happening in most industries is they've stayed fairly constant, but in areas like utilities, finance, and retail, that's Amazon's growth right there. These industries have gotten much more concentrated, and they're well above the threshold for what we would deem a healthy concentration, right? As economists, we love markets, but we love competitive markets. That's what we want. Markets are becoming much less competitive now than they were 40 years ago. Utility companies, much less competitive. Finance, much less competitive. Retail, much less competitive. And so you're going to see Amazon having a little bit more control. Right now, I'm sure this is a story down where you guys are. Kroger wants to merge with Albertsons.
Mhm.
And so all of a sudden I look around me and there's Target and Walmart and Costco, but the majority of the grocery stores are either a Safeway or a Fred Meyer, which is Kroger up here. And so all of a sudden now for hiring, if you're in that space, there's not many opportunities, right? If all of a sudden Kroger is hiring more than half of the workers. And so there is concerns there, absolutely. I'm going to be really surprised if that merger gets approved. We'll see. Technological change, we've talked a bit about this for sure. Computers, manufacturing, if you look at even an assembly line in the US today, it's computer, it's robotics. It's not people standing shoulder to shoulder assembling things. So certainly has made productivity much higher, but it's also taken away the need for, I don't like the term low skill. That's the term the econ profession tends to adopt. Low wage is, I think, a more appropriate term. Anyone that was in these low wage sectors the last 2 to 3 years, it was not a low skill sector, right? The skill to deal with some of with the public on a regular basis took quite a bit of patience that no one in the high wage jobs would want to do, is my take. So I don't like the low skill terminology. And obviously this is the worry as people like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos are seeing their incomes explode. And good for Elon Musk for creating what he did with his with the batteries and creating a sustainable electric vehicle. He also drives me nuts because he doesn't ever recognize how much he benefited from government subsidies for people to buy his electric vehicle. It's amazing how they quickly forget that. Jeff Bezos, not so much the consumer side of Amazon, but the web services, the cloud services that Amazon's created have been phenomenal. But that's going to leave a lot of questions, right? As their incomes continue to explode, what happens to everyone else, right? Those are the challenges we face, right? Is going forward, how do you, and I've mentioned this with autonomous vehicles, right? How do you, great, Uber now has built a fleet of autonomous vehicles, or Lyft has built a fleet of autonomous vehicles. So what happens to all the people that are already barely scraping by driving for Uber and Lyft? Right, where do they go? At a minimum, where do they go and find a job that compensates them to afford a basic standard of living? Globalization, I've talked about this quite a bit. In the US, a lot of our manufacturing lower wage jobs, we know in the 90s moved to Mexico. In the 2000s, there was a rush to outsource to China. So a lot of people, the concentration of job losses were extremely high in a lot of Midwest cities. And those workers still haven't recovered. There's still a lot of frustration, a lot of pent up anger about the jobs that were lost. So we know inequality is absolutely tied to the globalization. And that's going to continue, I think, across the board. You might see, like I said, some onshoring of production as companies reevaluate their supply chain processes. But I think you're going to see offshoring of more services, right? You're going to see accounting firms offshore some of their accounting services. We already see it with call centers, customer service centers. So that piece will absolutely still continue. So I'm going to kind of jump ahead here. So this is what I was talking about in terms of what is happening with workers. And you can see over time, the pie, the size of the pie that workers are getting has slowly been diminishing. In 1960, they were getting 2/3 of the pie. Now they're down to 58% of the pie. So it has gone down pretty steadily over the last 2 decades. And so again, contributing to some of those gains in the top 1%, workers are getting less and less, right? And this, certainly could be tied to some of the unionization story that we talked about earlier. So, why does inequality matter? And this is where I'm big on this. If you don't think you're going to get ahead because the system is stacked against you, no matter how hard you work, you can only see your income going up so high. That's going to be really hard to create motivation, right? And that's going to slow economic growth. We talked about this last time. I am worried about the future of economic growth. And if economic growth does stagnate for a period, addressing inequality becomes significantly more difficult. And if people don't feel like they can get ahead, it gets a lot harder to address things like climate change, right? It's hard to address climate change in an environment in which there's a lot of people that can't afford to make ends meet, right? Because they can't put their priorities on anything other than their own living. And you can't blame them. But then too much inequality has the same effect. So there is an amount of inequality we need to ensure people have incentives to work hard, because they do want to move up. They do see, the good our society provides. But in the same token, right, if they can never achieve it, then we're in the same spot, right? So what I worry about, too much inequality, right? As I said, it divides society. We see it today with the distorted political environment. People don't participate as much in the political system because they feel like it's hopeless. And then you get a spiraling because then people, you don't see money invested in education and the environment. So those are my concerns with where we are. And I think you're starting to see this. Society is divided. People aren't engaged in the political process. And the worry would be there's going to be a spillover. It's going to affect some of these other areas that really do matter. Racial differences. I'm going to show another really cool, I know I'm looking at time. another really cool visualization. It's from Raj Chetty's work, and I think you'll really like it. Raj Chetty's work has been highlighted in every single news place imaginable. And I'm gonna share this screen. And restart it. So part of Raj's work, and to me, this is really one of the stories that fits me, because I was born in 1981, and a lot of Raj's data is from people that were born in the early 80s. So the purple dots represent a Black child, a Black boy, and the green dots represent a white boy.
Oh my.
And this is people that were born in the top 20% of income. So if you were born in a rich, wealthy, or high income household, this is just tracking outcomes. So we're not making any subjective statement. We're not saying any of the why, but it's very clear. If you were Black, you have a much lower chance of remaining in that high income group than if you were white. And so it's taking that mobility graph I showed you earlier and painting a very strong visualization, right? So they just tracked 50,000 Americans from when they were born, their income of their parents, and just asked when they were 35, where did they end up? They do have a lot on the why, but basically, if you were white, your most likely outcome is you remained high income. 39% of white children, white boys born in wealthy families remained wealthy. Only 10% fell down and became poor. Whereas if you were Black, your least likely outcome was to remain in the high income group. That's pretty shocking. And they do the same thing for Black and white girls raised in poor families, Black and white boys. I mean, the boys one is a little bit more. I want to find this one right here. So you can customize this, follow the lives born in poor families, household income. And so this is all mothers. And this sort of highlights what I was saying earlier is, if you are born poor in the US, you're most likely going to end up poor, right? That mobility piece this shows this, right? But you'll notice the chance of moving into the top 40% of income earners, if you are Black, is really, really, really small. But if you are white, it's still small, it's still discouraging, but it's 3 times more likely than if you were Black. Again, half of all boys that were Black born as poor adults end up poor, right? And so that's the challenge, right? And there's lots of literature behind why this is happening and what's causing it and everything else, and happy to provide some quality research on those areas. At the end of the day, I think it's just important to recognize this is the extent of the problem. And to me, to say, oh, well, it's because the white children worked harder, had more effort, put in more effort for their outcomes is a cop-out, because that can't be the story, and it's not the story. But it's pretty disheartening to see those outcomes. So Raj has done it, and if either of you want these links, I'm happy to send you this data, because I think when people kind of visualize this outcome and you see where it ends up, it does tell you, okay, there is some societal challenges we have to overcome. And, you know, the extent of the George Floyd protest, I definitely don't agree with the looting and the rioting and the things that came out of it, but there was some gasoline that were poured, and it was the death of George Floyd was certainly the light that put that on fire. But it's from all of this, right? Decades of you know, ending up here, right? And I mean, the first one that we went through, I think, is just as telling. Even if you were born rich and in a high income household, for a Black child, their most likely outcome was to end up poor. Or one of their, I mean, they were pretty much all about 20%. So it's pretty striking, it's pretty sad. And you see this, right? Share of children from various earnings fifths ending up in the bottom fifth as an adult. It's literally that story that I just talked about, right? If you are born poor, you stay poor, right? But even if you are born rich, you're more likely to end up poor. And so that is one of the real challenges we have when we start talking about why is inequality rising? What about mobility? Those challenges, there's certainly an element of race to this. And so that's, you know, odds are better. You would much rather be born in the high income family, but compared to the white child, it's still much harder. So again, lots of stuff here. This has been an area that the media has covered a lot of, so I'm not going to go into a ton of stuff, but we know there's been lots of challenges for being a Black homeowner, right? Everyone talks about, hey, how do you build wealth in the United States? Oh, you buy a home. It's not easy to buy a home if you were Black in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Where I'm at in Spokane, we still have neighborhoods where people are finding the covenants that prevent Black families from living in these neighborhoods. It's terrifying. And if you know, they're not enforced obviously today, but if you were Black, would that be a neighborhood you would want to move in? Probably not. So here's the trade-off, and I'll end with this, right? Because I said some inequality is inevitable in the system, right? We want to incentivize people. The system we're in provides a lot of value in different jobs. We do want people. We want the doctor that's saving my life. I want him to have a good quality of life so he can save my life, right? We value that. We're going to pay the doctor more than we pay a custodian. So inevitably there is a trade-off. We as we increase efficiency, as we increase GDP, right, that income gets concentrated to a degree. But then at what point does the efficiency and equity trade-off lead to a big enough divide that actually hurts economic growth? Because I believe we're somewhere up here today.
Mm-hmm.
If I had to guess, that the inequality we are experiencing is demotivating people from working because they just don't ever feel like they can get ahead. So that's where I think we are. I'm gonna kind of, this is just summary stuff. Internationally, you will see for developed countries, inequality is the worst in the US compared to most other developed countries. If you look at Europe, Scandinavian countries, Australia, New Zealand, they seem to have it figured out. They seem to have that safety net, that social safety net system working in a much better way than the US does. Norway obviously has some additional benefit with some natural resources and things like that, but there is a system out there that helps reduce inequality without impacting economic growth. So we will end there. I know I have more here, trends, and I'll send this to you, Sally. Again, I have your email. But yeah, we got five or so minutes, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. Because I mean, you've witnessed all of this, right? You've seen the decline in unionization. You've seen all these things. So
yeah. And as a parent of someone who will not do as well as we did, it's very scary.
Yeah.
And the problems are so humongous that it is hard to see a way out.
Well, and that's the challenge of correcting inequality in my mind is there isn't, it's okay. I mentioned universal pre-K. And there's tons of studies that show the benefit, not just to the child, but to society of pre-K education well into the future. But convincing people today to spend money on something that doesn't derive a benefit for 15 to 20 years is really hard.
Yeah.
It's really hard. And I think that's probably one of the best things we can do to address inequality, to address some of the racial divides we're seeing across the board. But then you get people that just don't ever feel like anything's going to change, and so they just drop out of the political system, drop out of the voting system, and just don't care.
Yeah.
Go for it, Sally.
You said you liked universal basic income ideas.
I'm warming up to them more and more. I just don't know if it could ever be an amount to be enough is the challenge.
Yeah.
Is where I'm worried about. I like them because they don't distort the labor market outcomes, right? If you think about a minimum wage, you're basically putting the burden on an employer, and to set the right minimum wage, it's probably way too technical, because what the minimum wage needs to be in Spokane is different than the minimum wage in the Tri-Cities, which is 3 hours from me, which is different than the minimum wage in Seattle. So it gets really hard to determine and monitor that. So I would rather just have a federal government basically say, okay, here's a refundable tax credit every month, and it's a function of what zip code you live in. And if your income's above it, and it fades away as your income goes above a certain threshold. I like that a lot better.
I don't think a minimum, some kind of basic income has to really cover all the expenses of living. It could
No, I
just
don't think
be
it
a
does either.
certain lower amount so that people have something to start with.
I mean, it could be as simple as start it with $500, $1,000 a month. I'm really curious to see the study. So Stockton, California is doing this. They got a trial program to do $500 a month of universal basic income to a fairly large number of households.
Interesting.
Yeah, the other issue. Oh, did you, by the way, look at that thing about Thomas Paine and what he was suggesting for a social welfare system?
I haven't, but I will.
Anyway, the other issue is sustainability. In other words, should we be chasing economic growth at all? Aren't we consuming too much stuff so that we're depleting the planet?
Well, and that's actually, I mean, I literally just had this talk in class with a bunch of 18, 19-year-olds, right? Because I pose big questions on them, right? Like, okay, well, we've grown at 2% a year for 100 years. So if we continue growing at that rate, then how do we support our incomes that are now going to be not 65, not 130, but $260,000? And meanwhile, countries like China and India, they're going to keep catching up and they're going to increase their consumption. And the number of people on this planet is going to get bigger. So where does this stuff come from? And yeah, at what point does sustainability, if you want to ensure there is a planet for future generations, at what point do we go away from this pro-growth mindset into this sustainable mindset? I don't know, but it's, I mean, and so I do pose that to the students. I just say, you know, that kind of question. And even if population growth is only growing at 1% a year, yep, it's declining in the West, but it's increasing in lower income South America, African countries. So 1% is a fairly low projection. So in 70 years, instead of 7 billion people on this planet, we have 14 billion people. That's a lot of people. Where does the fresh water come from? Where does, I mean, we need to have trees to breathe. So it definitely creates an interesting challenge. But I'll add to it, that challenge is made harder if we're not growing though, right? Because we don't have, it's much easier to redistribute a pie that's getting bigger than a pie that's staying the same or shrinking.
We need to become more efficient rather than putting more and more stuff into things.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, efficient, but also when we say efficiency, I want to be careful. Because how we've defined efficiency in the past would mean doing more with less, which would also be less workers. So that would add to this inequality mess that we're dealing with. But I know what you're saying.
Less stuff.
Less stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we need to less stuff, more doing, less buying.
Yeah.
So, well, Sally, it was great meeting you. I'll send you these slides for you. Please feel free to email me if you have questions or if you just want to talk, go for it.
You've been amazing. Thank you so much.
Oh, you guys are welcome. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Sally. Take care.
Okay, I'm going to stop the
Thank you very
recording.
much.